Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3, American Federalism. It's Lesson 11, the Civil War. In this lesson, you'll learn about states' rights, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and the impact those amendments had on states' rights. We are learning about events in American history that changed the nature of American federalism. The first of those that we learned about in previous lessons was the Hamiltonian economic program. Now in this lesson, we'll learn about the American Civil War. The American Civil War was a civil war fought within the United States of America. It was fought from the years 1861 through 1865. The American Civil War was fought about the issue of slavery. Here we'll quote from President Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States at the time of the American Civil War, who pointed out that while there may have been other issues involved, everyone knew that it was really slavery that caused the war. Now, even though it was slavery that caused the war, there was a more general political concern that had brought the war about. That more general political concern can be seen in the declaration of the state of South Carolina of why it withdrew from the Union. Now, it was with the withdrawal of states, such as South Carolina, from the Union, as they tried to return to their previous status as independent little countries, that prompted the military action from the national government, which gave rise to the actual shooting and killing that made it a civil war. Well, why did states like South Carolina feel like they needed to leave the Union and become their own countries again? Well, as stated here by the state of South Carolina, they believed that the national government had encroached upon their reserved powers as states. Now, we've spent a bunch of time in this course already talking about how when people left the state of nature, they gave power to their governments, and then when they created the national government and assigned powers to it, certain powers were left back with the states. Well, that's what's being referred to here by the state of South Carolina. So while slavery is a specific example of a power that the states felt they had reserved to them, there's a bigger issue here of whether or not the national government was encroaching upon state power. So if we go back to the diagrams that we've previously constructed in this course, we can see this illustrated and understand what the state of South Carolina was referring to. South Carolina was talking about reserved rights of the states. That's the actual phrase they use, which has given rise to sometimes this term that is used, states' rights. Well, we can use our diagrams to explain what states' rights actually mean. So you can recall previously that we had this big gray circle to represent all the powers that people had in the state of nature. And then they assigned a bunch of those powers to their state governments. They delegated those powers to the state governments, while they reserved some of the powers to themselves. And the powers that they reserved to themselves are kept back rather than giving to the government. We call rights. Well, then they later decided that they needed another layer of government. And the United States national government was created, and powers were delegated to it. So now the people have delegated powers to two levels of government, state governments and the national government. But when they delegated powers to the national government, they took them from the states to give them to that new national government. So the powers that remained in the states, we can then call reserved powers. They were kept back. They were retained by the states and not given away to the national government. Well, just as the powers that the people reserved to themselves were eventually called rights, in a sense, we can call the powers that we reserve to the states rights also. The states have a right to use those powers, is the way it might be stated. And so that's the idea of what states' rights are. States' rights are essentially the same as powers reserved to the states. So if you ever hear someone use that term, states' rights, they're talking about powers that the states were given when they were initially created, that then were never turned over to the national government. And so the states kept them for themselves. So the American Civil War, in a sense, was fought about the right of states to determine for themselves whether or not they would allow the practice of slavery. Some states determined not to, generally in the North. Some states determined that you could have slaves, generally in the South of the United States. But it was a state issue originally. What gave rise to the Civil War was this feeling among the southern states that the national government was going to infringe upon their state rights, or in other words, their reserved powers, to decide whether they would have states or not. And it would force them to make slavery illegal, or the national government would just make it illegal within their boundaries. So the Civil War was really a question about who would, I should say, it was a war about the question of who would decide the issue of slavery. Who would control this issue? The national government or the state governments? So in that sense, the American Civil War was really a battle, a violent battle between the national government and the states over who would control certain elements of governmental power. These were elements that had traditionally resided in the states, and now the national government was asserting its authority, its power, to take over these issues and make them national issues instead. In the end, the national government won this war. And in the aftermath of that war, the national government's military occupied the rebellious southern states. And while it was occupying the rebellious southern states, it then forced the southern states to give up the political power that the national government wanted. It did this by passing a series of laws called the Reconstruction Acts. Here's one example, where the national government said that the rebel states that were currently being occupied by military armies that were essentially subjugated under the government of the United States, it said that those rebel states would have to adopt specific amendments that the national government had suggested be added to the Constitution. And it was only after the southern states, the rebellious states, had accepted those amendments that the national government wanted added, that then those southern states would be entitled to be again represented in the Congress of the United States. So until then, they would remain conquered territories. If they accepted the amendments that the national government wanted, then they'd be welcomed back in as full-fledged members of the country. So this was an extreme act of coercion on the part of the national government to force the southern states to agree to give the national government more power. So the amendments that were passed in this way were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment dealt with the issue of slavery directly and declared that slavery would no longer exist within the United States of America. It then provided that Congress would have power to enforce this legislation. In other words, once it was declared that there'd be no more slaves, Congress could then have power to force the slave owners to give up their slaves, to force the southern states to prohibit slavery. So the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, added a few years later, again, the southern states essentially forced to accept it, declared that no state could abridge certain privileges or immunities that people had as citizens of the United States, or that the states could take away people's life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or that the states could give people unequal protection of the law. So this was an amendment directly regulating the behavior of states. And the most prominent feature for us as things evolved in America is this notion of due process, that the states would have to go through certain procedures before they could enforce certain punishments upon people. The 14th Amendment, after telling the states what they were no longer allowed to do, then granted Congress again power to enforce the amendment. So if the states didn't obey what was being said, Congress could pass laws that would find some way to force the states to obey. So the 14th Amendment required due process, among other things. But that's the easiest one to remember for right now. We'll actually come back to the 14th Amendment in detail later in the course. The 15th Amendment guaranteed that people would have the right to vote regardless of their race. Now again, think about this in terms of states' rights. Prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment, who determined whether someone would vote in a particular state was the state government. Now, this amendment's being added to the Constitution, which removes that power from the states. Similar things happen with the 14th and 13th Amendment. Prior to passage of the 14th Amendment, issues like due process and equal protection were state issues. Now they've been put in the Constitution, states are required to behave in certain ways. The 13th Amendment about slavery, prior to its passage, the states would decide whether or not slavery was legal. After the addition of the amendment, states could no longer make that decision for themselves. So the 15th Amendment, like the others, after removing certain power from the state governments, then gives Congress power to enforce the amendment, to coerce the states into obeying. So the 15th Amendment allowed all races to vote. Let's now look at how these Civil War amendments affected the balance of power between the nation and the states. In other words, how it affected federalism in the United States of America. At the end of our discussion of the Hamiltonian economic system, we had enlarged the power of the national government to thereby illustrate the implied powers that the national government had assumed. Now, with this being the state of American federalism prior to the Civil War, let's see how the Civil War and the passage of the Civil War amendments affected this balance of power. This slide illustrates a contraction of the power of the states. You can see that as the states had their power reduced by the 13th and 14th Amendment, where they could no longer have slavery, where they could no longer discriminate based on race and voting, where they could no longer take away somebody's property without due process of law or imprison someone, things like that. As the power of the state was reduced in these areas, arguably the rights of individuals were being increased. And so that's why the diagram shows the white circle representing powers given to the states being reduced in size, and effectively the rights of individuals being increased in size. At the same time that that was happening, the power of the national government was expanding. It was expanding because the national government was given power in these amendments to enforce them, to force the states to obey the provision against slavery, to force the states to give people due process, equal protection, things like that in the 14th Amendment, force the states to allow everyone to vote regardless of race. So please notice as you consider this, or I should say, please think about this without just thinking about the morality of the issues involved. It's too easy to get caught up in the idea of, well, of course slavery is bad. They should have that power taken away. Or of course everyone should be able to vote regardless of their race. So the states certainly shouldn't have been able to do that anymore. It's too easy to get caught up in that and not recognize what this is doing to the balance of power in the country. Even though the outcomes may have been good, the method that was used was a method that was changing the constitutional structure. It was taking power away from the states and giving it to the national government. Now, while it was done through the amendment process, as it should have been correctly done under the United States Constitution, The coercion involved, where there were armies stationed in the South, forcing the southern states to agree to these amendments, to transfer power to the national government, shows that it wasn't simply a matter of we, the people in the country, deciding to create a new balance of power, particularly we, the people of the various states, deciding to do so. Instead, it was, in a sense, the national majority represented in the national government, forcing its views on the minorities within the states. When I say minorities, I don't mean racial minorities, I mean numeric minorities in the southern states, and requiring them to give up power that they otherwise would not have wanted to give up. So in the end, the Civil War results in smaller amount of state power and greater amount of national power, and arguably more individual rights also, particularly for the African Americans who had been freed and now had the opportunity for full-fledged citizenship with all the rights that go along with it. So the result of the Civil War was that the northern states voluntarily ceded power to the central government through the Civil War amendments, while the southern states were forced to give up power. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What are states' rights? Are they inalienable state powers, inherent state powers, reserved state powers, or implied state powers? We learned that states' rights are basically the same as the reserved powers of the states. What did the 13th Amendment do? Did it end the Civil War? Did it end discrimination in voting? Did it end unequal treatment of people, or did it end slavery? The 13th Amendment ended slavery within the United States of America. What did the 14th Amendment do? Did it readmit states to the Union? Did it require due process? Did it protect state powers? Or did it provide voting rights? Well, the 14th Amendment actually did quite a few things, but one of the important things it did was require states to give due process, in other words, fair procedures to people before they could take away their life, liberty, or property. As I said before, we'll talk a lot more about the 14th Amendment later in the course. What did the 15th Amendment do? Did it remove Northern troops? Did it provide equal protection? Did it prohibit the slave trade? Or did it allow all races to vote? The 15th Amendment required states to allow anybody to vote regardless of race. And what was the impact of these amendments on states' rights? Did it reduce the reserved powers of the states? Did it expand the delegated powers? Did it expand enumerated powers? Or did it reduce expressed powers? Well, it reduced the reserved powers of the states. In other words, it took away some of the states' rights. That does it for this lesson. The next lesson will be from Unit 3 also. It'll be Lesson 12 about the New Deal and the Great Society.